The video game industry is one of the most important contemporary creative industries, both financially as well as culturally. Video games have become popular culture, and ever since their introduction on the commercial market in the early 70s, they have steadily grown into a multi-billion-dollar industry. Given the medium's cultural importance, it would be worth keeping a record of its history. While the desire to create large and comprehensive video game collections in university libraries and archives does exist, the process of establishing these collections has been a challenge. Private collectors have been amassing their own collections for decades, but the process for cataloging and archiving video game heritage in a formal academic setting is a fairly recent endeavor that dates back only a little over 15 years. For as long as institutions have been collecting materials, there has never been only one way of arranging records. This problem runs deep in the world of archives, and it is not limited to only one specific medium. An archive records information on all of its holdings in a database, and these databases are arranged according to an archival standard. Different standards will prioritize certain kinds of information which is more or less relevant depending on the medium of the record. These standards have been designed to be as future-proof as possible, with the ability to adapt to new and developing mediums and technologies, but this is a difficult task. For example, a standard needs to accommodate for both books, a simple, pre-digital medium which has existed for millennia, as well as a complete in-box copy of Super Mario Bros., a new medium, at least by archival standards, which is a digital file stored on a circuit board housed in a plastic shell. These two objects could not be any different. Thinking about this further, how do you go about classifying all of the items within the complete package? Do you label each component separately, or do you group them all together? Would you classify the manual as a book or a pamphlet? There is also the problem of no standardized style guide for the language used to describe the metadata associated with different games, making communication and collaboration between different archives difficult and confusing. How, after all, do you accurately summarize an entire game in only a few words in a manner that makes sense to not only yourself, but also to other people? This means that even though two institutions might have similar holdings, or even worse, they have holdings which complete the other's incomplete records, you would not be able to tell by looking through their databases. Another problem is the amount of effort necessary in maintaining the facilities used to actually play the games that institutions acquire. In order to be able to play a game, you not only need a copy of the game in question, but you also need to own a console that can play that game, remotes, and a monitor that is capable of properly displaying the video signal coming from that console. To complicate matters even further, certain games can only be playable on a peripheral add-on for a pre-existing console, in which case it is not sufficient to own just the base console or just the add-on, but to combine both of them. To actually own a copy of all the necessary components for play is one problem, but to have all of the necessary parts in working order is another problem entirely. A 40-year-old piece of hardware may have passed several hands before landing in the care of an archive or collector. Some previous owners may have taken care of their objects, others may not have been as delicate. Even if the game or hardware is working at the time of purchase, there is no guarantee that it will continue to work for years to come. There is also the question of the stability of the materials. Video games have been printed on a variety of different formats, some proving to be more resilient than others. Many older computer games were distributed via cassette tapes. Magnetic media is infamous for being volatile, and as such, games exclusive to this format are in constant danger of deteriorating and being lost to time. Even games stored on sturdier formats like cartridges are not made to last forever. Chips rot, pin connections corrode with time, internal batteries die, and repair involves a great deal of knowledge and expertise, especially when considering the vast amount of consoles and games that have been released. These problems relate to the logistics involved in video game collecting, though there are additional problems associated with game preservation that are unique to the format. A game is not just the actual code itself. It is also the physical space in which a game is played, the hardware associated, and the ephemera that surrounds it. The physical hardware, along with the design of the game controller, affect a player's experience. Not all game controllers are built with the same features or designs, and in separating a game from the hardware it was designed for, compromises must be made. The controller on an Intellivision is unwieldy and awful in a way that you can only really understand by trying to use one yourself. One of the solutions that collections have sought to solve this problem is to provide the player with all of the original hardware that the game was meant to be played on. While this solution usually works for games designed to be played on a console, there are contexts in which it is inadequate. For example, what is the most authentic way to play an original Game Boy game when the different models of the original Game Boy vary so greatly? For example, the screen on the original 1989 model is significantly worse than that of the Game Boy Pocket, which is itself different from the Game Boy Color. These models share the majority of their library. Which should you choose to play on? PC games pose an even larger problem because there is no standardized, definitive computer on which users can play games. PCs are customizable machines. Parts within a computer are replaceable, meaning that the computing power of different PCs can vary greatly. This means that for computer games, there are only minimum system requirements for a game to run, and depending on the power of the specific computer running a game, the experience could vary. How does an institution decide what is the proper way to experience a PC game? Additionally, on a PC, there is no unified control scheme like there is on a console. With a console, players can only play their games with a specific compatible remote, whereas on PC, players can choose between playing on a keyboard with a mouse or on a game controller of their choice. Keyboard commands are programmable by the player to perform a specific function, and more than one game controller can connect to a PC. No specific controller arrangement is necessarily more correct than the other, and so there is not often a definitive way in which a PC game can be presented. Video game ephemera is another important aspect of the way a player interacts with a game. Ephemera includes, but is not limited to, the packaging that the game was sold in and the manuals it came with. Manuals used to be essential in order to understand how a game worked, particularly with older titles from the 1980s. Oftentimes, when you would boot up a game, there would be no explanatory text which contextualized the gameplay or provided instruction on how to play the game. This information would instead be found in the associated manual. There are even cases in which the manual contained solutions to in-game puzzles, as is the case for Star Tropics on the NES, where players had to physically dip a page from the manual into water in order to reveal a code necessary for advancing through a section of the game. The ephemera surrounding a game is much harder to obtain than the game itself, especially when trying to find it in good condition. While games were often stored on hard plastic cartridges, the game packaging was made of cardboard and its manuals printed on paper. There is, after all, a reason why so many boxes for games on the Sega Genesis survive today in comparison to those of the Super Nintendo, because despite being roughly the same age, plastic is a much more durable material than cardboard. When institutions can, they will acquire a complete game with its box and manual, but acquiring a complete game significantly increases its price, a difficult reality when considering the limited budgets that libraries and archives have for making new acquisitions. Additionally, as game collecting becomes an increasingly popular hobby, certain games in high demand become several times more expensive than they were at the time of their release. While the creation of dedicated video game collections is important, it is not the only avenue available for the preservation of video game history. One of the most significant forms of community-based preservation is emulation, which is the practice of making games playable on platforms they were not originally intended to be played on. Games are only programmed to be able to play in specific conditions, which in the context of console gaming means that you can only play a game on the console that it was designed for. Emulators work by simulating the way that a console operates, making it possible for a different machine to run those proprietary files. There are two main forms of emulation: original format emulation and ROM-based emulation. Console manufacturers will oftentimes create their own proprietary media formats, meaning that unless there is another console which offers backwards compatibility between console generations, there is no way to play the physical copy of an older game on anything but the console it was originally designed for. What an original format emulator does is that it recreates a specific console's hardware, allowing a player to run games printed onto those proprietary media formats on a machine that is not the original console. This requires that the user buys original software which may be old and expensive, and when buying second-hand, there is no guarantee that anything will work. A ROM-based emulator allows the user to run digital files containing entire games on their computer, named after read-only memory chips which are used to store a game's information on a cartridge. This allows for the easy transfer of video games between users via the internet. Dedicated websites that allowed users to download and share ROM files date back to the mid-90s. Despite the limitations of the internet at that point in time, ROM files were relatively easy to share given the smaller file sizes of older titles. ROM-based emulators are an important resource for players looking to engage with older titles. They offer unrestricted access to any player worldwide so long as they have an internet connection and a computer strong enough to handle the system they are trying to emulate. Emulation is a democratic resource capable of transcending borders, allowing users to play games that might not have been released in their country. Additionally, because emulators are free, they are capable of crossing socioeconomic boundaries, allowing for any user to experience a game no matter their economic standing. Because ROMs do not exist as physical objects, there is also no fear of physical degradation, though data corruption is a whole other issue in of itself. Emulation is, however, not without its drawbacks. As previously mentioned, the experience associated with playing a game is not entirely derived from the game itself, but also the context in which it is played, as well as the ephemera surrounding it. When emulating a game, the game is separated from its hardware, which affects how a player interacts with it. That being said, it is impossible to deny the advantages that emulation brings. A holistic approach to engaging with the video game medium could include the use of an emulator, along with an intimate knowledge of a game's original hardware and its associated ephemera. Emulation could allow for a researcher to interact with a game outside of the walls of an institution to which the physical copy of a game might be bound, as is the case with the University of Toronto's Sid Bolton collection, which houses over 14,000 games. Students are free to access and play these games for research purposes, though because it's an archive and not a library, these materials cannot be checked out. Copyright laws pose a problem to emulation. Because ROMs are so freely accessible, they are in direct violation of copyright, which can result in legal troubles for people that run ROM distribution websites. Though it is within their right to sue, some companies have adopted a relaxed stance on emulation, deciding to turn a blind eye to the practice. Other companies are very strict with copyright and invest lots of time, money, and effort into stamping out any online ROM distribution. One such company is Nintendo, who in recent years have had an increasingly aggressive approach to quell emulation on their software. The company has filed lawsuits against several popular ROM distribution websites, winning many of the suits that have gone to court. Websites have been shut down because of these legal battles, and the individuals who run these sites have been found personally liable and made to pay thousands in damages. These heavy-handed approaches are not just ethically questionable, but they also represent a loss to video game heritage as well as a loss of community. ROM websites are also a popular place for users to share their homebrew applications and fan games. Many ROM websites host games from platforms other than just Nintendo's, meaning that access to games outside of Nintendo's catalog also become inaccessible through website takedowns. Accessibility is a significant issue when it comes to older titles. Nintendo goes to great lengths to ensure that their older titles are not being circulated via ROM websites, but emulation is sometimes the only way that communities can access certain games. Though the company has made efforts to make their older titles legally available, the results have had a varying amount of success. When the Wii launched in 2006, Nintendo offered a way for players to purchase select older titles via the Virtual Console online store. The Virtual Console sold the ROMs of older games from a large variety of consoles at a low price, which the Wii would then emulate. Every Nintendo console since has had their own variation of the Virtual Console, which allowed legal access to the company's older catalog of games. While this is significant for making older games legally accessible, the service is not without its faults. Every console collection has several notable titles absent from their catalogs for inexplicable reasons, including first-party developed titles that Nintendo holds sole copyright over. Perhaps the largest problem is the amount of titles offered. The Wii had a total of 427 games from 9 different consoles and various arcade games available in North America. The Wii U had 311 games available in North America. Not only were there fewer games available, but it only had collections of games from 6 different consoles. These 6 console catalogs were not all present on the previous iteration of the Virtual Console, so while there was some overlap between which consoles were represented, there was also some notable absences. The first and second Switch both share the same lineup of consoles, but their games are available through a 2-tiered subscription service. As of writing, the base subscription fee for an individual costs $30 a year, which grants users access to a total of 220 games from only 3 consoles. Players also have the option of upgrading with the expansion pack, which costs a total of $70 a year for an individual membership, which adds an additional 148 titles from 5 other consoles, with GameCube games being exclusive to the Switch too. This means that even with the highest subscription tier, players have access to fewer games than they did on the Wii. These games are also released at a much slower pace, with only about 3 or 4 games being released a month for the past several years. The subscription model also means that players need to keep paying a fee for access, whereas they previously only had to pay a one-time fee for the games they wanted, keeping costs lower in the long run. These official emulators are not perfect either, and many of them are filled with performance issues. The Wii U had trouble replicating the color palette of the NES, meaning that games appeared duller than they would have running on original hardware. The issues with the Nintendo 64 emulation on Switch shortly after release have been well documented online, so I won't go through the trouble of re-explaining them here. Another issue with Nintendo's virtual consoles is their lifespan. Nintendo is a business after all, and its interests do not lie in the preservation of gaming heritage, but rather in the generating of a profit. At times, these interests overlap, like in the case of the Virtual Console, but Nintendo has not made any lasting commitments to game preservation. Maintaining virtual consoles on outdated hardware costs money. It costs money to keep internet servers operating, and it costs money to keep the rights to release games from other companies on the service. When it is deemed that a virtual console is no longer profitable, Nintendo will shut down the service, blocking access to hundreds of games. As each iteration of the Virtual Console offers a different selection of software, emulation becomes the only reliable method of experiencing certain titles. Games already purchased and downloaded from the Virtual Console continue to be playable, but with time, the internal storage of different consoles will fail, with players losing access to their collections. Nintendo currently offers players the ability to re-download games already purchased from past Virtual Consoles, though it is not a guarantee that they will continue to offer this service. Video game preservation is an ongoing effort undertaken not only by cultural institutions like libraries and collections, but also by passionate fans creating emulators and ROM files to share with others online. The cataloging of physical hardware and ephemera by cultural institutions offers a more complete experience for those looking to interact with video game history. However, it is important not to discount emulation as an important resource for research, making video game history accessible to anyone with a computer and internet access. When combined, a holistic approach to video game research can be undertaken. Because of copyright law, emulation is unfortunately in constant threat. It is not within the interests of a video game manufacturer to allow for emulation to exist, as it poses a threat to their bottom line. Though without emulation, players' access to older titles becomes severely limited, resulting in an overall poorer understanding of video games and their history.